She was humiliated at the store on New Year's Eve. The rancher didn't look away. The humiliation began before Eli Mercer even stepped fully inside the store, the sound of it carrying through the open door in the form of laughter that was sharp enough to mean something had already gone too far. And he paused with one boot on the threshold, instincts tightening before his mind named why. It was New Year's Eve, the kind of day when people felt entitled to judgment because the calendar itself suggested endings, and the store was crowded with neighbors shaking off winter and boredom. Voices louder than necessary, eyes hungry for distraction. In the center of it stood Clara Wynne, hands clasped at her waist, coat buttoned wrong in her haste, cheeks burning red not from cold, but from being made visible in the worst possible way. And the shopkeeper's voice cut through the room as he repeated the accusation again, slower this time, as if clarity would turn cruelty into fact. Eli saw the way she didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't look for allies in the room, because endurance had already taught her what crowds did to people who tried to defend themselves. And that was when the laughter shifted, growing bolder in the absence of resistance. Someone muttered a comment meant to be clever, another repeated it louder, and the humiliation took on a rhythm, each voice feeding the next while pretending it was just harmless talk. Eli stepped inside fully then, the bell above the door ringing once, and for a moment the room hesitated, not because he was known for force or authority, but because his presence disrupted the easy flow of looking away. He did not move toward Clara, did not speak, did not raise his voice, and the restraint of it unsettled the space more than anger would have, because it forced the moment to keep existing without cover. The shopkeeper glanced at Eli, and then back at Clara, repeating the claim about unpaid goods, about trust broken, about how some people expected charity just because the year was ending. And Eli watched Clara's eyes fix on a knot in the wooden floor, her shoulders held still by will alone. And he understood this was not about debt or truth, but about spectacle. The crowd waited for something to happen, for her to cry or run or argue, and when she did none of it, the silence that followed felt uncomfortable enough that someone else laughed to fill it. Eli took off his gloves slowly, every movement deliberate, and set them on the counter without breaking the line of his gaze from the space where Clara stood. And in that small, ordinary act, the balance shifted, because by refusing to look away, he made it impossible for everyone else to pretend they hadn't seen exactly what they were participating in. Eli did not speak right away, and the delay unsettled the room more than a shout ever could, because silence, once shared, demanded ownership, and everyone inside the store felt it settle like weight they had not agreed to carry. The shopkeeper cleared his throat and repeated the accusation, this time directing it outward instead of at Clara alone, as if volume could recruit agreement, and a few heads nodded reflexively, the habit of aligning with authority easier than questioning it. Clara stood exactly where she was, hands still clasped, posture straightened by resolve rather than pride, and Eli noticed how she kept her chin level, refusing to offer the bowed head humiliation usually demanded, even as her eyes stayed down to avoid giving the crowd what it wanted. Someone near the shelves muttered that rules were rules. Another said it was a bad night to make exceptions, and the words stacked up quickly, not because anyone believed them strongly, but because repetition made them feel safer. Eli watched the way the talk moved, how no one owned it once it started, and he understood that cruelty often wore the mask of consensus, each person hiding behind the idea that responsibility had already been claimed by someone else. He stepped closer to the counter then, not toward Clara, but into the space where the story was being shaped, and asked the shopkeeper calmly what exactly was owed, the question simple enough to sound harmless but precise enough to slow the momentum. The shopkeeper hesitated, riffling through papers that suddenly mattered less than they had moments ago, and the pause exposed the thinness of the charge, the way accusation had arrived before proof. Eli waited, hands resting on the counter, posture relaxed, giving the man time to either clarify or retreat, and the room leaned forward unconsciously, sensing that something had shifted from entertainment to accountability. Clara looked up then, just once, her eyes meeting Eli's for the briefest moment, and he saw there not hope or appeal, but recognition, the awareness that someone had chosen to stand inside the moment rather than around it. The shopkeeper finally named an amount, uncertain now, and Eli nodded as if noting a weather report, then asked when the debt had been agreed to, and under what terms, the questions stacking quietly, each one requiring an answer that could not be supplied by laughter or volume. The crowd grew restless, the pleasure of the moment draining as attention turned inward, and Eli felt the balance tip again. Not toward resolution yet, but toward discomfort, because the silence had taken sides, and it was no longer Clara's alone to endure. The answers came slower now, each one arriving with less confidence than the last, and Eli felt the shift settle into the room as the crowd realized the moment had changed shape without asking their permission. The shopkeeper spoke again, but his voice no longer carried the easy authority it had moments earlier, the words weighed down by the fact that they were being examined rather than absorbed. And Eli noticed how several people began to look at the floor or the shelves, suddenly busy with objects that did not ask them to decide anything. Clara remained still, her presence steady in a way that refused to feed the story being told about her, and Eli understood that endurance, once exposed, often confused those who depended on reaction to justify their behavior. Someone near the stove muttered that it wasn't their concern, and another said they were just passing time until closing, excuses offered like shields even as they fell short of protection, and Eli saw the truth of it clearly now. The humiliation had only worked because it had been shared. He asked the shopkeeper again about the terms, not raising his voice or repeating himself louder, just letting the question sit where everyone could hear it unanswered. And the pause stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, the kind of discomfort people felt when they realized they might be required to remember what they had witnessed. The shopkeeper shifted his weight and said the goods had been taken on trust, that times were hard, that New Year's Eve made people sentimental, explanations layered over one another in place of evidence. And Eli nodded once, acknowledging the effort without accepting the substance. He reached into his coat and set coins on the counter equal to the amount named, the sound of metal sharp and final, and the room reacted at once, not with relief but confusion, because payment closed one story while opening another. Eli told the shopkeeper to mark it settled and said nothing else, and the man did as told, the transaction completed with a reluctance that exposed how little the debt had ever mattered. Clara's shoulders eased by degrees she could not fully control, and Eli felt the room search for a new script, one that allowed them to leave without carrying the weight of what they had done. Someone laughed awkwardly. Another spoke about the cold, the ordinary sounds returning as if they could erase the last 10 minutes, and Eli watched them carefully, knowing resolution without acknowledgement often taught the wrong lesson. He turned then and faced the room, not accusing and not pleading, and said quietly that New Year's Eve had a way of revealing what people were willing to be part of when they thought no one would name it, and the words landed heavier than any threat because they did not offer absolution. He took his gloves from the counter and stepped aside at last, giving Clara space to move without spectacle, and as she passed him, the crowd parted instinctively, their attention no longer sharp but uncertain, because the moment they had counted on to pass unnoticed had been seen, paid for, and remembered, and the script they had relied on no longer worked. Clara did not rush for the door once the coins were counted and the ledger closed, because haste would have handed the room one last advantage, and Eli noticed how she paused instead, drawing a breath that steadied her shoulders before she moved, the smallest reclaiming of pace that mattered more than apology ever could. The crowd parted as she crossed the floor, not out of courtesy, but uncertainty, the kind that followed when people realized they had misjudged the safety of silence, and Eli stayed where he was, refusing to turn her exit into a performance by escorting her or claiming credit for the moment. The bell rang again as the door opened, letting in a blade of cold air that cut through the store's warmth, and Clara stepped into it without looking back, her dignity intact precisely because no one had asked her to display it. Eli waited a beat longer, long enough for the room to understand the ending was not his to narrate, then pulled on his gloves and moved toward the counter to collect the supplies he had come for, keeping his posture ordinary so the moment could not be reframed as drama. The shopkeeper rang up the items with unnecessary care, eyes avoiding Eli's, and when he handed over the change, his fingers shook just enough to betray the cost of being named, and Eli accepted it without comment, understanding that shame, when earned, required no assistance. Outside, the winter light had thinned toward evening, the kind that flattened color and made everything feel exposed, and Eli stepped onto the boardwalk where Clara stood a few paces away, staring down the street as if relearning its shape now that the crowd's weight had lifted. He did not ask if she was all right, or offer to walk her home, knowing that kindness offered too quickly could sound like another claim, and instead he said only that the roads would ice early, and she might want to take the long way by the livery. The advice practical and neutral. Clara nodded, the gesture small but deliberate, and thanked him once without embellishment, the words neither debt nor praise, just acknowledgement. And Eli tipped his hat and turned away before the exchange could be witnessed and reinterpreted. As he walked toward his horse, he felt the store behind him settle back into its ordinary noises, the crowd eager to resume a night that could still be saved if they pretended the interruption had been brief and forgettable. And Eli understood that the real consequence would arrive later, when memory pressed against comfort and refused to be dismissed. He mounted and rode on, not watching Clara's path and not needing to, because the walk that followed was no longer theirs to shape, and whatever the town chose to do with the moment would have to account for the fact that it had been seen, slowed, and answered without spectacle, leaving behind a discomfort that would not easily be laughed away. Eli did not ride straight back to his ranch, not because he intended to intervene further, but because moments like the one in the store rarely ended at the door. They followed people home in quieter forms, reshaping conversations, glances, and decisions that pretended to be unrelated. He tied his horse near the livery and walked the length of the street once, noticing how voices dropped when he passed, how laughter sounded thinner now, the residue of a moment people had expected to forget but could not quite shake. Clara had already disappeared down the side road he'd mentioned, choosing the longer path without hurry, and Eli understood the choice for what it was. Not escape, but control. The decision to move through the town on her own terms, rather than under its gaze. Inside the store, the humiliation had been loud, but outside it settled into something more persistent, a discomfort that clung to those who had participated and those who had watched without acting. And Eli knew from experience that such discomfort either hardened into resentment or softened into restraint, depending on whether it was named again. He stopped at the feed counter to collect his grain and felt the clerk's eyes flick to him and away, the exchange clipped and careful, and it told Eli the story was already being retold, altered at the edges to reduce personal cost. Someone would say the shopkeeper had gone too far, another would say the rancher had embarrassed him, and a third would claim it was all a misunderstanding made worse by the season. But none of those versions would fully erase the image of Clara standing still while the room laughed, and that image would do its work quietly. As dusk settled and lanterns came up one by one, Eli rode out along the frozen road, thinking not of what he had done, but of what he would do next if the town decided to press the lesson back into its old shape. He resolved to return to the store in daylight later in the week, not to check on Clara or confront anyone, but to be seen again, to make the interruption part of routine, rather than an exception that could be dismissed as a holiday anomaly. The idea settled easily, because refusing to look away once was an act, but refusing to look away twice was a posture, and posture changed how people behaved when they thought no one was watching. By the time Eli reached the bend where the town lights thinned and the land opened back into fields and fences, he felt no surge of satisfaction or regret, only the steady sense that the moment had not closed but widened, that what followed Clara out the door would not be pity or protection, but a recalibration of how easily the town used silence as cover. And Eli understood that the real test of New Year's Eve would not be remembered in the laughter that returned later that night, but in the restraint that might, or might not, appear when the next woman stood alone and the crowd waited to see whether looking away would still be allowed. He returned to town 3 days later in full daylight, choosing an hour when the store would be busy for practical reasons rather than idle gathering, because moments that survived scrutiny did so best when folded into routine instead of revisited as spectacle. He tied his horse where it could be seen and stepped onto the boardwalk without hurry, feeling the familiar tightening that came when a place remembered you for the wrong reason and had not yet decided what to do with that memory. Inside, the store smelled of flour and cold wool, ordinary sounds filling the space, and for a moment it almost worked, the illusion that New Year's Eve had been an exception rather than a mirror. But then the bell rang behind him, and heads turned just long enough to register that he had come back. The shopkeeper stiffened at the counter, his greeting delayed by a fraction, and Eli took note of it without reaction, setting his list down and asking for supplies in the same tone he always used, forcing the moment to live in daylight instead of memory. Clara was not there, and Eli felt a small, private relief at that, because her absence meant she was no longer required to carry the weight of the lesson for everyone else. As the shopkeeper gathered items, conversation resumed in cautious fragments, people speaking around the thing they all knew had happened, and Eli let it remain unspoken, understanding that naming it again too soon would let others frame it as his grievance, rather than their participation. When the total was named, Eli paid without comment and waited as the clerk counted change with unnecessary precision, the room holding its breath just long enough to feel the discomfort settle again. Then, without raising his voice or shifting his stance, Eli asked the shopkeeper whether he had changed how accounts were handled, whether accusations would still be aired before proof. The questions delivered as business rather than rebuke, and the effect was immediate and visible. The shopkeeper cleared his throat and said policies were being reviewed, that misunderstandings would be handled privately going forward, and Eli nodded once, not accepting credit and not offering forgiveness, because the words mattered less than the fact they had been said where others could hear them. A man near the stove shifted his weight and muttered something about keeping things decent. Another agreed too quickly, and Eli saw the recalibration happening in real time, not justice, but caution. The first step silence took when it realized it could no longer pretend neutrality. Eli collected his sack and turned toward the door, the transaction complete, and as he stepped outside he felt the town adjust behind him. Not because it had become kinder overnight, but because it had learned that some moments did not dissolve on their own. He mounted and rode out without looking back, satisfied not because he had corrected the past, but because he had made it harder for the same harm to pass unnoticed again. And he understood that refusing to look away was not a single decision made on a holiday night, but a discipline practiced in daylight, repeated until it became part of how a place remembered itself. The change did not announce itself loudly, and Eli noticed it only because he had learned to watch for the places where noise used to be, the pauses where someone once would have spoken without thinking, and now chose silence instead. He returned to town again the following week, not for supplies this time, but to deliver a load of fence posts, giving himself reason to move through the street slowly, to be seen without making himself the point, and he felt the difference immediately in the way eyes tracked him, and then looked away, not dismissively, but carefully. Inside the store, conversation stayed low and practical. Jokes cut short before they sharpened. And Eli understood that restraint had begun to replace confidence, the kind of confidence that once fed on public moments and assumed no one would interrupt. The shopkeeper greeted him with politeness that bordered on caution. Transactions handled quietly now, ledgers kept close, and when a woman questioned a price, the answer came measured and private, not broadcast for comment. And Eli felt the echo of New Year's Eve settle into the room without being named. Outside, he passed two men talking who stopped mid-sentence as he approached, then resumed with different words once he had gone by, and Eli knew the town was rehearsing a new version of itself, one where looking away no longer felt entirely safe. He saw Clara only once that day, across the street near the dry goods, her posture composed, her steps unhurried, and she did not acknowledge him beyond a brief nod that carried completion rather than dependence. And Eli felt a quiet satisfaction because her life had not become a continuation of his intervention. What mattered more to him was the way others treated her now, not warmly and not generously, but cautiously, the laughter that once followed her steps absent, the glances shorter, the silence less weaponized. Eli lingered longer than usual, letting routine stretch, because lessons that lasted needed reinforcement, and as afternoon wore on, he noticed how the town adjusted its edges, cruelty losing its ease when it sensed it might be seen twice. A boy dropped a sack of grain and waited for mockery that did not come. A woman corrected herself mid-sentence before a remark could land, and Eli recognized the pattern forming, not kindness yet, but hesitation, the moment where people decided whether the cost of speaking was worth the comfort of habit. When he finally rode out, the street returned to its rhythm, but the rhythm had changed, slowed by awareness, and Eli carried with him the understanding that humiliation thrived on certainty, and once certainty cracked, even slightly, the crowd no longer knew its lines. He did not mistake this for justice or transformation, only for an opening, and he accepted that because openings were where change learned how to begin, and refusing to look away had done its work not by ending the story, but by forcing the next chapter to be written with care. New Year's Eve came and went, and what followed it mattered more than the night itself. Because Eli understood that humiliation rarely announced a single return. It tested whether the ground would accept it again once the calendar turned ordinary. He rode into town one evening near closing, the cold pressing close and the lamps already lit. And he felt the difference immediately in the way people occupied space. Not warmer or kinder, but more aware, as if the room remembered what it had almost allowed and adjusted its posture accordingly. Inside the store, a woman argued softly over a measure of flour, and the shopkeeper lowered his voice to answer her, stepping aside instead of calling attention. And Eli marked the change because restraint, once learned, often hid itself in small corrections. A pair of men laughed near the shelves, and then caught themselves, the sound trailing off unfinished, and Eli saw the hesitation land before embarrassment could harden into defiance, the crowd no longer certain it could pass moments along without cost. Clara was not there that night, and Eli did not expect her to be, understanding that presence after humiliation was a choice, not an obligation, and the absence itself did its own work, forcing the town to remember without being given another chance to perform. He purchased what he needed and waited at the counter longer than necessary, letting the room sit with the quiet that followed, and no one rushed to fill it, which told him the lesson had settled deeper than words ever could. When he stepped outside, the street felt ordinary again, not cleared or redeemed, but adjusted, as if it had learned where the edges were and how easily they could be crossed if no one paid attention. Eli rode home under a sky stripped clean by cold, thinking about how easily the night could have repeated itself if no one had interrupted it, and how repetition was often the real measure of harm. Not the first act, but the permission that followed. At his ranch, he tended the animals and set his gear aside, the quiet there honest and uncomplicated, and he felt the contrast clearly now, the difference between silence that hid harm and silence that simply rested. He understood that what he had done in the store had not changed people's hearts, and it did not need to, because change that lasted often began with behavior rather than belief, with hesitation where certainty once lived. As he sat by the fire, the image of Clara standing still returned to him, not as guilt or pride, but as reminder, and he accepted it as such, knowing that refusing to look away was not about one woman or one night, but about the discipline of noticing when ordinary places invited cruelty to pass as routine. The town would test itself again, he knew that, because crowds always did, but the night had not repeated itself, and that, for now, was enough to tell him the ground had shifted and would remember the weight of being seen. Eli did not expect gratitude to follow what he had done, and when none appeared, he understood that was how he knew the moment had not been turned into a favor, but into a change the town would have to carry on its own. He rode in less often now, not withdrawing but allowing space, because presence that lingered too long risked becoming a signal people performed for rather than responded to honestly, and he wanted to know whether the restraint he'd seen would hold without him nearby. When he did pass through, he noticed the subtle weight that remained, the way conversations bent before sharpening, the way accusations softened into questions before they could grow legs, and it told him the memory of New Year's Eve had settled into routine rather than fading into story. Clara returned to the store one afternoon in clear daylight, her entrance unremarkable on the surface, coat neat, steps steady, and Eli happened to be there only because he needed nails, not because he was watching for her, and that mattered because the moment belonged to her alone. The room shifted when she came in, not dramatically and not kindly, but cautiously, the kind of caution that acknowledged boundaries without naming them, and Eli saw how she moved through it without bracing, her posture unchanged, her voice level when she spoke to the clerk. No one laughed, no one whispered, and the absence of reaction felt heavier than the cruelty had, because it required effort, the kind that meant the town remembered what it had almost become. Eli stayed where he was, refusing to step into the frame and turn the visit into a sequel, and when Clara paid and turned to leave, she caught his eye and nodded once, a gesture of completion rather than thanks, and he returned it without pause. After she left, conversation resumed slowly, testing its edges, and Eli felt the weight settle again, the collective understanding that some lines, once crossed and corrected, did not welcome casual crossing again. He paid for his nails and stepped outside, letting the cold clear the room from his lungs, and as he mounted his horse he realized the work was nearly done, not because the town had become just, but because it had learned restraint, and restraint was often the first visible sign that shame had lost its appetite. Riding home, Eli reflected on how little it had taken to interrupt the pattern and how much it would have cost to ignore it, and he understood that refusing to look away was rarely about grand gestures, but about being willing to stay present when staying would be inconvenient, and leaving would be easier. The road stretched ahead, familiar and quiet, and Eli felt no pull to return immediately, no unfinished edge pressing at him, because the weight that stayed behind belonged to the town now, not to him, and carrying it would decide what kind of place it became when the next moment came asking whether cruelty would be allowed to pass as entertainment again. Winter settled fully after that, the kind that pressed days inward and forced people to live closer to their choices, and Eli felt the story close not with ceremony, but with the steady confirmation of ordinary behavior holding where it once had not. He rode into town less often now, not because he avoided it, but because nothing pulled at him anymore. No sense that something unfinished waited to be steadied by his presence. And when he did come, the place met him without tension, without expectation, simply as another man moving through a day. The store kept its business quieter, disputes handled low and close, laughter no longer eager for an audience, and Eli understood the change had rooted itself not in fear of him, but in memory of what the crowd had seen itself do when it believed no one would intervene. Clara moved through the town on her own terms now, sometimes alone, sometimes with others. Her name no longer carried on glances or half-spoken judgments, and Eli noticed that she did not alter her path when he appeared, did not seek him out or avoid him, which told him the moment had resolved properly, leaving no imbalance behind. On a cold afternoon near the end of January, he passed her outside the store, and they exchanged nothing more than a nod, the kind given between people who shared a fact rather than a bond, and Eli felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that dignity, once restored, did not require guardianship. The town settled into its year with a little more caution around its edges, not kinder perhaps, but less careless, and Eli understood that was often the most lasting change a single moment could produce, a hesitation where certainty once lived. Riding home at dusk, the fields pale and still, he reflected on how easily the night in the store could have vanished into laughter and excuses if no one had stayed present long enough to slow it down, and how little it had taken to alter that outcome. Not strength or authority, but the refusal to pretend not to see. When he reached his ranch, the animals greeted him with the uncomplicated indifference he preferred, the quiet there, honest and unburdened, and he tended to his work without thinking of the town again. The year turned forward without asking his opinion, carrying with it a memory that would surface whenever voices grew sharp, and a crowd sensed permission forming. And Eli knew he would recognize that moment again if it came, the tightening in the chest, the pause before stepping away. For now, though, the ground held, the lesson remained, and the story ended where it should, not with gratitude or reward, but with a place that had learned, however imperfectly, to watch itself when the easy path invited cruelty to pass as nothing more than a night's entertainment. If this story touched your spirit, share it so that the voices of the ancestors are never forgotten. Like and subscribe to Native American Tales, where every time we bring you another cinematic legend, where pain meets purpose,